This is Glenn Kiser, and welcome to another in our series of Dolby Institute and SoundWorks collection podcasts, Conversations with Sound Artists. This is our second season, and I'm really excited today to be joined by Nevin Steinberg. Nevin is a theatrical sound designer, having most recently worked on Hamilton, which is a show that I'm sure that you've all heard about. So I'm really excited to have Nevin on the show today. We've talked with a lot of film and television and video game sound designers, but I don't think a lot of people really think that much or pay attention to theatrical sound design. And so I'm really thrilled to have Nevin on the show today to talk to us about what he does and the differences between doing sound design for musicals versus, I guess, legit plays is the nomenclature still. But Nevin has been doing amazing work for a long time. I looked you up on Broadway Internet Database, and it looks like you started with the full Monty, which was an amazing show.
Yeah.
You were on Gypsy and Avenue Q, Spamalot. I want to talk with you about that because Mike Nichols is one of my all-time great heroes, and I would love to hear what it was like to work with him.
Yeah.
You were on the revival of Chorus Line. You worked closely with our good friends Larry O'Keefe and Nell Benjamin on Legally Blonde. In the Heights, title of show. I'm sure I'm just embarrassing you at this point. I have to say the motherfucker with the hat because I love saying that.
Right. Yes, that's a must.
Venus in Fur, which I saw on Broadway and just blew me away. And obviously, Hamilton. So the audience for this podcast has really turned out to be pretty varied, but we have a lot of film students. We've got a lot of people who are interested in sound design. And I think it would be really useful just for you to kind of explain a little bit about what sound design for a Broadway show or any kind of live theatrical environment means.
Yeah, that's probably a good place to start. I try not to be too funny about it, but my reductive answer about it is basically I make stuff louder, right? I mean, that's my job is, to the layperson, that's how I explain it because it's a difficult and complex task. But at its most basic, live sound from the reinforcement end is really about communicating the event to a large group of people, and whether that be 100 people or 1,000 people or 10,000 people, that's the job. In my world, the venues, and we can get specific about it later, but on Broadway, the venues range in size from about 800 seats to about 2,000 seats. That's really the range. Mm-hmm. So it's not a wide range, and these are not huge venues, but you're talking about intimate stories often, sometimes with 2 or 3 people, up to maybe 20 or 30 people being communicated to a relatively tidy group of people and generally in historic architecture. So these are the challenges, and this is kind of the matrix of problems that you come up with. So from there's the primary job of a sound designer on Broadway, which is basic reinforcement, how to communicate the spoken word and music to a large group of people in a pleasing and somewhat homogeneous manner to the entire venue. That gets leveled up when you start talking about conceptual ideas about how that style of reinforcement matches the material. There's of course monitoring issues that have to be dealt with, which are complicated both for the cast and for the musicians. There are synchronization issues that come with lighting, automation, and projections, which also fall into my department. There are communication and video issues, which fall under my department. And then there's also a wide range of atmospheres, playback, ambiances, or sweetening, as you might call it in the film world, post-production work that would normally fall in post-production for the film and television world, but falls into my world as part of the live event as well. So it's a pretty wide range, and that can, as I say, can go from anything from something like what you saw in Venus and Fur, which is a 2-character play in a confined single set, to something like Hamilton, which is 22 people on stage and an epic 2-hour and 45-minute story told entirely through song. And
so I'm curious about the process. So you've got, obviously, if you're talking about a big show like Hamilton, you've got the songs, you've got multiple things going on. You've got obviously you've got a house with the Richard Rodgers has one balcony. Is that right?
Yeah, one large balcony. Yep.
So, and you're trying to optimize the performance for everybody because I've looked online. I know how much those people are paying for those seats. So you're trying to make sure that everybody has a good experience, but you're also dealing with, you're monitoring for the cast so they can hear their performance. There's also a certain amount of I think what we would more traditionally call in the film business sound design, but you're calling atmospheres and sweetening, sound effects basically.
Yep, absolutely.
So this is a huge mountain of material, and obviously with something like Hamilton, one of the most important aspects of your job is to make sure that it's articulate and that people can understand what people are saying and singing. So how do you even start? Like, what's your entry point? How do you start that process?
Well, one of the things that many of your listeners may not realize is the timeline for something like Hamilton or any big musical is rather long. And the object of the game, from my point of view, is to get involved as early as possible, because the more I know, kind of the more grinding I can do on these kinds of things and really think about how we're going to do it. Now, of course, the venue, doesn't get decided until later. And often you're talking about multiple venues. Hamilton, for example, played the Public Theater, which is a 280-seat theater downtown in the East Village, and then moved to Broadway, which is 1,300 seats on Broadway. So, the venue will change. And that, of course, has a tremendous effect on my approach. But from the other side, about how to approach the kind of elements of the sound design, either playback elements or synchronization elements, or the kind of sound you want to hear and how you're going to affect the voices, how you're going to deliver the score, those kinds of decisions, those get developed over a long period of time. I get to experience a lot of these shows in their early development process, which is often what we call a stand and sing. It's a reading. The actors will rehearse for 20 hours in 1 week, and at the end of the time, they'll literally stand at music stands, no amplification often, with just a piano, or in this case, if something like Hamilton, it'll be a piano and maybe some beats, some loops that are played on Ableton. And we will be in the room while this happens, either for the entire rehearsal process or at least some of it, and certainly for these last couple of days where they're presenting, and just start to hear the score and just start to hear the words and try and get a sense of what's happening with the piece. And that will then, the next step in that process might be a workshop or a lab, which we call them, these are actually actors' equity categories that are this is about labor. This is about unions, but
I'm sure these are all very carefully defined.
They are.
Things with boundaries and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, but for our purposes, they're basically steps in a developmental chain, right? This is the way a show gets developed and evolves and gets an opportunity to be heard and worked on in a controlled environment. And when we do a workshop, we'll often add amplification, we'll add microphones, we'll add maybe a small band. And again, I participate in these things not just as a problem solver, so that when we present them to interested parties, including investors and producers and directors and other design members, but also for me to start to talk about the process by which we're going to kind of, get this thing, have it blossom into a bigger event. And I think the key thing here, and this is also good for people who don't know show business, but who understand film and TV, is that I believe that the dialogue that surrounds these events is actually the most important part of the job. Talking to the director, talking to the choreographer, talking to the music department, talking to the composer, and really having conversations about what their goals are. Because ultimately my job is to try and determine what we're all trying to achieve as a story making team, as a storytelling team, and then figure out my part of that, how to take responsibility for my part of that. And often that involves very close collaboration with obviously a lot of other individuals, including lighting designers, set designers, costume designers, projection designers. But mostly it's those conversations that start to motivate me, and that's how I develop kind of a mental approach and I guess I would say a mental picture for what this thing is going to start to sound like in my head and what it wants to sound like in their heads. And we sort of marry those things, and I try and build on that. And so when I start to approach a solution, both from a technological point of view and from a content point of view, so let's say from a response to the geometry of the architecture. And what I mean is like a sound system, just a delivery system and a routing system, how I approach that. And then how I approach the content, which is in this case, the sound design, the sound effects and the atmospheres and the ambiences. Those things are informed by those conversations. And I develop those over a very long period of time. And the mental picture of what this could and should sound like becomes more and more refined over time.
Sure.
And with something like Hamilton, I even go so far as like sitting down with the musical supervisor and the orchestrator and listening to demo orchestrations very early in his process before he's committed them to paper, so that he and I are starting to have conversations about how the score is going to interact with the vocals. How is this music going to be produced essentially for the stage, and how can I help make sure that we're getting it all, and that it's taking care of the vocal lines, and that we're really feeling the energy of it. So
I generally like to be as well prepared for these conversations as I possibly can. I have not seen Hamilton,
okay,
despite repeated attempts, because I just didn't want to pay $3,000 for a ticket. And I would love to talk with you about this at some point. Like, what is it like to be involved with something that explodes like that and becomes such a phenomenon?
Yeah.
But I don't think we've ever seen ticket prices like that for, on a Broadway show. The last time I tried again a couple of months ago, and I didn't realize I think it was like 2 weeks before Lin-Manuel Miranda was leaving the show. So literally the cheapest ticket that I could find online was up in the back right of the balcony for $2,900.
Really? Oh
yeah.
My goodness. Wow. I was just about to say that I know it sounds pretty good up there, but I'm not sure it sounds that good. I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah, I was just so there were single seats going in the first 5 rows of the orchestra for $9,000 to $10,000. And it's amazing to me that we live in a society where people can and do pay that.
Yeah.
But that was all my long-winded way of saying we're going to have a conversation about Hamilton, and I haven't seen the show, so I'm shooting a little bit in the dark here. But of course, I've listened to the cast album and read as much as I could. So,
well, I will say I'm proud to say that one of the things about the cast album, just a little insert here, is that a lot of times I don't listen to cast albums of my shows because I find them to be a little bit demoralizing, because I work in what I like to describe as a hostile environment. Right, live is very, very hard, and we have constraints that no studio guy has ever encountered. And so sometimes when I hear these cast albums, I just feel like, wow, they could just do whatever they wanted. There's like it's like a free pass.
These pristine studio recorded cast albums.
Yeah. And I think my shows a lot of them sound pretty good, but like you listen to that and you think, oh, that's what really that's what they're doing. Like you can do that. And so I usually have a policy of not listening to cast albums until the show closes. I try not to put my ears on them, because I find that this doesn't help me, frankly, and it doesn't help. It's just not informative. But I will say that we did listen to the Hamilton cast album actually as a group. There was a listening party just before it dropped on iTunes, which was pretty exciting. And there was a moment where I looked over at my front of house engineer, Justin Rathbun, who's excellent, and kind of gave him a nod, because what I was hearing on the cast album was something that actually really closely resembled what we had done live in a way that made me very happy. It really felt like they had listened to the show and had created something, which is, I think, a stunning piece of record producing. It's a beautiful album, and they went farther in certain areas than we could do live. Mm-hmm. To take nothing away from them, but I think it does actually bear some resemblance to the live event in a way that makes me very happy as a guy who's responsible for the live event, right? Knowing that you and hundreds of thousands of people, that their only experience of the show at this point is the album, is not. It's actually encouraging to me, because it's
not heartbreaking to you.
No, exactly, exactly, which is good, and that's a testament to the guys who made it. Yeah.
So the specific genre of the singing in the show is obviously, I think you would say, not traditionally Broadway, but there's a lot of rapid fire vocals going on, and stuff moves very fast. There's a lot of overlapping. Obviously, that must have presented a challenge for you in terms of designing a system that's going to reach and be articulate in every seat. So does this get down to like basic math? Like, what are the tools that you use to sort of articulate that and try to figure out? This has got to be a great engineering puzzle for you.
It is. And that's job one. That's the basic job one of any musical, is really, people want to hear the words. They want to, and particularly in a musical they don't know, a new musical. So that, to a certain extent, that's always the task, right? How do you make sure that people can hear the show? With Hamilton, obviously the stakes were a little higher, because as you described, it comes very fast. And I think not only is it fast, but one of the things that people don't realize about it is that it's sung through. meaning that there are no book scenes in the show.
Right.
I think there's maybe one paragraph of spoken word, non-rhythmic spoken word in the piece. The rest of it is sung or rapped. Which also makes it hard on the ears of an audience, right? It's not a familiar place for us to live. We're used to getting a rest and listening to dialogue in a book scene and getting some of our exposition through something that's a little more familiar before people break out in song, and that doesn't happen in Hamilton. In addition, the musical styles, most of the music in the show, I wouldn't say all of it because that's kind of the genius of it too, is some of it skews the other way, but most of it is incredibly muscular and powerful. Of that muscularity and power, as much as we could, we'd also be falling short, right? We'd be doing the show a disservice. So all of these things kind of ratchet up the stakes of what is the normal job, which is how do you just communicate the words and music of a show. Well, Hamilton kind of made us all buckle down and think about it much more intensively. And I think this is where designers do jobs differently. I like to, it is a math problem. It is a lot of geometry. It is a lot of using the tools that manufacturers make available to you for loudspeaker predictions and things like that. And it is a lot of imagining how you want sound to travel, from the stage through the theater and kind of working backwards from the theater seating back to the stage, essentially imagining a source on stage and imagining a source in an orchestra pit. And again, matching the mental picture in your head, what this thing may want to sound like and feel like in a theater for an audience member, and then kind of imposing that, laying it over the architecture and saying, oh, okay, well, this is where I want the sound to come from. This is how I would want the sound to be distributed. This is where I will need help in certain problem areas because architecturally this is a challenge because of an overhang or a shadow from a seating box. This is going to be a challenge because of scenery and where loudspeaker positions can be because of scenery and lighting and how those need to be shared. But you sort of start from pie in the sky and work your way back and basically say, this is the kind of gear we need. I mean, really, the joke I make often is that it's New York, so real estate is everything. Just like it is for an apartment rental. These theaters are small and cramped, and there's a lot of people trying to fit a lot of technology in them to make these shows happen. So it isn't like a rock and roll PA where you can hang, hundreds of line array boxes anywhere you want and just cover the whole stadium that way or the whole arena that way. These are very compressed spaces, and there are very limited areas where you can put equipment to do the job you want. So it's about refining an idea about conceptual idea about what something wants to sound like, and then refining that idea to include appropriate tools to make it happen. And that, that's about familiarity with tons of tools, essentially.
Yeah. And a lot of these spaces are obviously, they're historical spaces as well. So does that, does that present issues of sort of like, well, I have to, this whole space is made of plaster. So how do I, it's obviously a very live, reverberant material. How do you deal with that sort of thing as you're designing the show? Yeah,
sometimes you do. Sometimes you're able to make the plaster issue and the structural issues are ones that we bump up against all the time. And we have to work very closely with the theater owners to make sure we're not destroying their building, basically. Although these buildings are used over and over for this purpose, so it's not uncommon, but these conversations happen on every production about, I want to put something here and it's going to go through the ceiling and we need to make sure there's structure above it because it's just plaster and it's obviously it can't fall on people's heads. So a lot of those problems have to get solved along the way. The issue of acoustics is a big one. And, some of these theaters are acoustically live and some of them have already been treated in the past and have some acoustic treatment. The Rogers, where Hamilton is actually pretty live. I think it's one of the things that the creative team who made In the Heights and which I was a part of and who now made Hamilton actually likes about the space is that there is no question you're hearing a live event. And part of that is due to the somewhat live acoustic signature of the room. So sometimes it drives me a little crazy, but on the other hand, the audience is never under the impression that the orchestra isn't live or that the cast isn't doing it live. There's a real sense of a live happening in that room, and I do think that a great deal of that is due to the fact that it's reverberant. That when we do push sound into the space, both just with the spoken, the spoken word, the human voice, and the amplification system, that it rattles around a little bit and makes you realize work is being done, and I think that builds the excitement.
So one thing I'm curious about. So you're describing a process that sounds like it has a lot of R&D attached to it, a lot of experimentation. How much? I mean, I know this just probably varies on every show, but how much time do you get in the theater to do all that work without, I mean, Tech Week is always just such a, nightmare of all these pieces crashing together, lighting and the costumes for the first time and the, actors in the space. And so do you get unfettered access to the theater for a while to do your tests and to install your gear and all that stuff before this circus starts?
Yeah. Most of the time I try and make one or two visits to an empty theater prior to specifying equipment anyway. And that's a visit to as many of the seating areas as I can get to, just to sit and contemplate. I bring a sketch pad now and just kind of draw things and scribble things and make notes about where are likely places and what kind of equipment I might be looking for. I try not to get too specific about, manufacturers and models at that point, but sort of, the kind of architectural specifications of what I might be looking for to solve problems in different seating areas. And then I might go back if I have an opportunity and do that again and refine those things. I take a lot of photographs, obviously, and we look at CAD drawings, a lot of computer-assisted drawings of the spaces also to do analysis. I'll plug a lot of that into prediction programs from speaker manufacturers if I start focusing in on how to address certain things and whether some of the gear might be suited for certain jobs on a particular show. And then the install of the sound equipment is concurrent with the install of everything else, the lighting and the set and the projection, and no projections on Hamilton, but typically there'd be projections. So all of that starts to come in the building at the same time. On Broadway, that can last anywhere from 2 weeks to a month, usually, maybe even a little more, that whole install process. So we're putting all that stuff in with everyone else. I skipped a step, which is once the equipment is specified and the system design is specified, the sound system is actually assembled off-site at the rental shop, at the vendor, to be labeled, assembled, and tested before it gets installed. So we have one opportunity right off the bat to make sure the system's performing in the way it's been designed. That's in a shop, so that's in pieces,
Sure.
But then once it's put into the building, we then will get. It depends on the show, but on a musical, typically I get 8 to 12 hours of time in the theater with just the audio crew and to do analysis, verification, and tuning.
And what are you using to test the system at that point? Are you using playback, or do you have some actors who come in and just vocalize for you, or what's that process?
Generally, I use a system verification tools. Either in my case, when the budget allows, I'll use Meyer Sound Sim 3, which is a great system verification tool. It allows multiple channels of microphone inputs throughout the theater, and we send test program, either program or test tones or pink noise into the theater, and we can measure both the performance of the system. We can verify the system electronically end to end, essentially from the console through, but then we can also measure it acoustically at all the listening positions, depending on how many microphones I can deploy. Sometimes on Hamilton, I deployed 24 microphones through the theater, and I'm able to essentially look at the system performance at all of those microphones and turn on and off the subsystems and make sure that not only are the loudspeaker systems performing as advertised and as expected, but then see the interactions and also help as needed tune the sound system to the room if there are things in the room that are either being that are out of bounds. I can try and tame them. So that's a way of doing the initial verification and setup of the sound system. From there, I'll proceed to some playback, some program that I know, and I'll balance the system by ear after that. And then we'll often put a microphone on either one member of the sound crew or an actor or somebody and have them talk on the stage and make sure that things are performing, that we're in a good place to start, which is actually all you can really do. I mean, there's no way to get this thing all buttoned up by that first day of tech, but
of course,
but we can get to a good starting place and feel confident. And you talk about Tech Week, which is sometimes Tech 2 weeks. It depends on the show. And I have a motto with my staff, which is we get to the end of the first day of that craziness, which is adding the cast, adding the costumes, adding the lights, adding the turntable or whatever it is in the scenery. And if we get to the end of the day and sound comes out and nobody got hurt, we're good. We're that's like, day one is that's gotta
be a heartbreaking day.
Yeah. Right? No, it's actually a great day. I mean, I find tech to be very exciting because it's the day, it's finally where things are, you're finally heading in the right direction, and whether you're going to be okay. It's a long road and you've got a lot to do. There's a lot ahead of you in terms of refining the system and deciding about how to resolve the delivery issues that you're going to encounter. But boy, it's fun to finally get down to work. That's a great day.
I'd love for you to talk just a little bit about mix delivery and track assignments, and not to get too off, too wonky about it. But I think most of my listeners are obviously very familiar with 5.1 sound systems and 7.1 channel-based sound systems.
Yep.
And obviously at Dolby we've developed Dolby Atmos, which is an object-based system that allows you to target specific speakers in the array in the house. But is that a little bit close? Sort of what you're doing? Do you have the ability to target any individual speaker in the space, and how are you actually accomplishing that?
Well, our sound systems. I know I did a little studying on Atmos actually a couple of weeks ago because I've been curious about that innovation in the cinema world, and it's fascinating and really cool. And there are people who are starting to do similar things for live as well. We basically mock up a surround system, but our systems, the output count on a theatrical sound system is often we're in the tens and dozens of outputs long before Atmos came out. I mean, we've been
sure.
Hamilton has something, I forget how many individual loudspeakers Hamilton has, but it's I think it's a couple of hundred. It's two and a quarter or 230 different loudspeakers on stage, and
you can target any one of those specifically.
Not exactly. We sometimes combine them into zones. So particularly things like monitoring, we wouldn't target those individually unless we had specific sound effects we needed. But we could. I mean, that's actually a system design question. The need to target those speakers. We wouldn't do it as a matter of course because it's an expensive and complicated thing to do. But we can.
Because the other thing that you're trying to do is you're trying to make the show. I mean, as much as you can, you're trying to keep it simple to operate.
Yes.
And simple to perform because you've got to perform the show live 8 shows a week.
That's right. And there is no just kind of pushing the button and making it go again. But from an output point of view, that's really that's kind of the fun part of the game. And for the audience, having a system that has multiple points of resolution where I can choose paths to the audio system for example, and this is actually probably will answer your question. So for a principal vocalist, for example, in a musical, one of our principal characters who's constantly on stage, we might have a stereo path to the sound system for those principal vocalists. And that path will be distributed to the sound system to 64 or 80 outputs essentially at any point, and each and the same with a stereo path for the ensemble vocals for the back, the people on stage who may not have individual lines. There'll be multiple stereo paths for the orchestra, and the same thing. And each of those paths can be mixed into each of those output areas into the zones of seating. And we're talking about, I would say, somewhere around 24 seating areas if you had to kind of break it up. And those mixes can be adjusted to each of those zones individually. They could be done dynamically. They're generally not. Once we kind of dial those in, that delivery path is pretty static as a general rule. And then we get into surrounds, and we do tend on big musicals. I tend to hang our surround system, which mocks up basically to a 5.1, a 5-channel surround system. Again, in zones where we'll gang a few speakers together. We won't necessarily try and address them individually, but again, if the show has a tremendous amount of surround content or special effects that need to travel through the theater in a very complex way, we can and have done surround systems where we can address each speaker individually. So I think, as you say, the idea is to kind of create paths that are simplify the delivery system, but still give us lots of resolution on the output side to make sure that we can really refine. So, for example, somebody on the main floor might be hearing one mix from, at where they're sitting, they might be hearing 4 or 5 or 6 different loudspeaker systems combining to address that seating area, where somebody in the back of the balcony where you tried to buy a ticket in the rear right hand, they might be hearing only 2 systems really, right? They might be hearing a main array and a delay system that's associated with it. And then of course you add subwoofers to that and surround, and things get pretty complicated pretty fast. So my goal as a designer and as somebody responsible for delivering the material to the audience is to try and give them a very high quality experience and have the tools to do it, right? Have points of resolution, have points to address each of those seating areas where I feel confident that if there are issues in the mix or if there are issues in just SPL and delivering, the volume of the show, I can do that and have many places to go and turn a knob electronically, essentially, to get them what they need.
Talk to me a little bit about, I'm just curious about the role of sound effects in a show like Hamilton and in Broadway shows in general. I think, we wouldn't normally associate live theatrical shows as heavy kind of tour de force sound effects pieces. But I think that it seems like there were quite a few opportunities for that in Hamilton, especially in the use of time transitions.
Yeah. There's two big moments of sound effect, I guess, virtuosity in Hamilton. One, I think, is the story of the gunshots, the story of cannon fire and gunshots. Because the duel is obviously a central plot point, and duels play a role throughout the show. We actually have 3 duels in the show, and 2, and then the final duel that everybody knows about. And, the idea of how to establish gunfire in the show and make it meaningful and have it tell a story as an arc throughout the show was very interesting. And this was great discussions with Tommy Kail, the director, about what those gunshots want to feel like and how to tell that story, and how we start with basically a vanilla gunshot, kind of a very simple gunshot, I like to call it, that, and these are period gunfire from excellent libraries, actually, in this case, that have been modified for our show. And then we exaggerate the gunfire as the show goes on. And then when this is a little bit of a spoiler alert, I guess, but when Hamilton's son dies, he's killed in a duel, and that gunshot is actually given sort of a hip hop treatment. It's chopped and screwed a little bit to give you a little bit of a stutter, which actually you can hear the audience gasp. When we made that change off Broadway, that was originally just another gunshot, and when we gave it its kind of special treatment and gave it a little bit of a point of view, I like to think, the audience response was palpable. It was something you could actually hear every night, and it was a great success. And it's a lot of, fun is the wrong word because it's a tragic moment, but it's a great moment of pride for me in storytelling, to enhance the storytelling. And then the final gunshot, there's actually 2 of them because we stop one in time. And this goes back to what you were saying, is how you can stop time with sound. The ultimate gunshot in the duel is actually we stop it. We arrest it and reverse it. And that's what triggers the turntable move and Hamilton's final soliloquy, before we actually return to real time and a final stirring gunshot, which ultimately kills Hamilton and ends our story. So there's a great opportunity there for sound to help us understand that we're pushing pause in this story,
right,
and that we're going to an internal place. The gunshots do that, and I play with that a lot, even with the cannon fire in Right Hand Man and Yorktown. There's a lot of fun stutter effects on those cannons as well, to mimic some of the things that will happen later. So, it's a pretty thorough approach to something that seems simple. The other moment that's a real stop time moment, a real time machine moment, is in what we call the helpless satisfied transition, where Eliza sings of meeting Alexander Hamilton for the first time at a party at the Winter's Ball, and having been introduced to him by her older sister, Angelica. And of course, the love story begins. But at the same time, Angelica realizes that she too has fallen for Alexander, but steps aside for her sister. So what we hear first is "Helpless," which is Eliza's declaration of love. But then at the wedding, we actually, as Angelica makes a toast to the bride and the groom, we stop time in reverse and do what we call the rewind. And then we hear the whole story again, except from Angelica's point of view and the tragedy of her having missed out on what we think is the love of their lives. And there's a great moment of choreography and lighting and just, I think, really something that never fails to stir me, which is this reverse of time that happens on stage choreographically, and the turntable backs up, and in the midst of it is Angelica with her glass aloft in the middle of this toast to the bride and the groom, and we play back a reverse version of the score that we've just heard and overlay the voices, heavily processed voices of Eliza and Angelica, singing some of the phrases that you've just heard in Helpless, but actually foreshadowing some of the things that Angelica is about to sing live on stage in just a second. And so there's this incredible woven tapestry of a very visceral sense of reversing time and foreshadowing and also callbacks from things you've just heard. I say it's great, and it sounds like it's not that I'm not being humble about it. It's just actually conceptually, it's great. Lynn and Tommy and Andy thought of something really beautiful, and we were able to dig in and really make something cool.
And are you sampling the vocals on the fly and processing them and feeding them back into the track?
Not that one. That moment is actually pre-records where we bring our Elizas and our Angelicas into the studio and their understudies, and this is kind of a funny story too. And we actually do the processing offline, and we play back in synchrony the tracks, multiple stems, in synchrony with click track to the orchestra, so they can play along and come out of it right on time. Depending on who's on that night, because obviously on Broadway it's 8 shows a week and anything can happen. We have understudies for Angelicas and Elizas, and so we often have to substitute those stems depending on who's on. So we basically have all those stems on hand and can easily make those switches. But that you brought up vocal sampling is interesting because we do that a couple of times in the show. We do live vocal sample for Burr on the song "Wait for It," and this was
there's an echo.
Yeah, right? There's an echo, and we do that a couple of times in that song, and that's kind of another cool moment that was conceived by Lin-Manuel Miranda, the composer, as an idea that Burr actually is one of the characters in the show who has a relationship with time that's different than Alexander. Alexander's always fighting against time, and Burr's actually always trying to slow time down and hold on to time, to be deliberate, to wait. And he sings of this in this big first act song called "Wait for It." And we actually do sample his voice live, and we grab it live with a delay and feed it and mix it back into the live event. And we do that throughout the song, and you can hear that on the cast recording. It's pretty cool.
It's one of those things where the audience probably doesn't even realize how complicated that is.
They have no idea.
It's actually super difficult, isn't it?
It's super difficult. And that's a good example to go back to what we talked about very earlier about how do you get to those things? Like how do you even arrive there, right? And the answer to that is it's something we talked about a year before we got to Broadway. A year and a half ago. It was an idea that came up in a conversation, and we had to decide, are we going to try and pre-record that? I was asked, can you do it live? And I said, I honestly don't know, but let's try it. Let's make sure we try it. And we did it in one of the workshops. We just spent a little time and said, let's give it a shot. And what does that want to sound like? And we do that, and there it is, and then we have, like, that gets added to the vocabulary of the show as a way to and as you can see, that's not an answer to all of the questions, right? Like this one we do live, satisfied rewind, we do pre-record, right? There's many answers to these questions, but having an idea about developing those ideas and what's going to be required of you and what you aspire to as a participant in this story is the fun part, right? I mean, you can hear how excited I'm getting just talking about it, because that's what gets me jazzed.
That's the fun stuff.
Yeah, that's the fun stuff. How do we elevate this story and take it beyond the simple communication of words and music? How do we actually participate in the storytelling in a significant way using all of these tools that we have at our disposal and all of the plans we've made? How quickly can you pivot and incorporate these ideas? And yeah, that stuff gets me really jazzed.
Your person who is actually on the mixing console every night in the theater is they're earning their salary, aren't they? They're not just putting figures at zero and letting it ride.
No, it's a very active job. I sometimes wish everybody could actually see him and her. We have two mixers in New York, Justin Rathbun and Annalie Craig, and they're both fantastic. And I'm just, every time I think of it, I'm just so proud of them and so happy that they're there. And they both do a great job. And it's like riding a bucking bronco. It's Justin described it as, the top of the show. There's no overture. It's basically 10 notes, and you're off and running. It's dun da 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 dun 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 da da da, and then it's basically 2.5 hours of just a flat out sprint. So it's a big job.
I wanted to ask you about that, because the first time I listened to the cast album and that 10-note thing just explodes. I thought I have a feeling there's no orchestra, there's no overture for this show. Yeah. So historically, the overture has served this kind of transitional purpose to get the audience into the mood and get them to stop talking and get them to hear the show is now about to begin. But you guys just hit them in the face. Yeah. So what happens right before that? Are they milling around and talking, or like how do you? What is that first 90 seconds of that show like?
It's incredible. In the theater live, we bring the house lights to half prior to that, which settles the crowd a little bit, but also it gets them. They're so happy to be there now, having paid their however much they paid for their tickets. they get a little excited. We often get a cheer when the house lights go to half, which is kind of incredible. And then you hear a pre-recorded announcement about cell phones. Basically, a very typical thing on Broadway is to just please desperately ask people to turn off their cell phones, which only works part of the time. And it's actually on our show, we have King George doing it. He does a cell phone announcement in character, which is pretty great. And that's pre-recorded. And then right after that, the house, we usually get that usually gets a hand or at least a laugh, because it's pretty funny that it's King George and we haven't met him yet. And then the lights go down and the spotlight comes up and we hear those notes, and Aaron Burr walks into his light to start our story. And it's very stirring. I have mixed feelings about overtures. I mean, some of the classic overtures, I'm a great lover of musical theater. I've always loved it. I grew up with it, and I'm one of those people who knows a lot of the original overtures from great shows like Gypsy and Guys and Dolls and Camelot and all of these things. And I'm fond of overtures, but I think it's also very powerful to start a show without one and to just enter into the world. And I think Hamilton asks a lot of people right at the beginning. I think, having heard the album, I think people are ready for it now. But if you're starting in the theater and you don't know much about it and you're walking in, those first 90 seconds actually, and I would say even more, maybe even 2 or 3 minutes, it can be a little disconcerting. And I've heard from people who love the show, and I mean love it, unequivocally love it, say that those first couple of minutes are very hard to settle into. That can be true of any Broadway show. I think, musicals are just, even though we're familiar with them in concept, being in a room with people who are singing is a little weird, when they're trying to tell you a story. And I think audiences have a little bit of a hard time dialing in at first. But that said, Hamilton in particular, because it's just an unfamiliar mode to have this rap coming at you, and you're seeing something historical, but clearly this language is not historical language. I think there's a little bit of a Shakespearean moment where you just need a minute to get your brain settled on the communication style. And once you're locked in, I think most people that certainly I have, and most people around me when I sit and watch the show dive right in. They accept it very quickly. But there is a little moment of what is going on here? What am I seeing? What am I hearing?
Well, and there's we see this sometimes in films. There are certain directors, I know that David Fincher has played with this in the past, of wanting to not even have distributor logos at the beginning, just no credit sequence. You just start with in the middle of the first scene, and it has this interesting kind of effect. And I think you must be seeing this in Hamilton a lot, because the language exacerbates it. It's sort of like you're thrown into the deep end of the pool, and you just got to start swimming, and the audience will catch up, and they will meet you if you provide them with a challenge. And I think that's really what's happening there.
And I think that's one of the great magic tricks of theater in general, and particularly of Hamilton, which is that it makes the audience feel smart, right? There is that moment of unsettledness, of discomfort, but ultimately what you're doing is you're saying, I trust you. I believe I trust you enough that I don't have to explain this to you. I'm just going to start doing this thing, and eventually you're going to figure it out because you're smart people, and you'll be with me. And Hamilton really does that. It is a deep end of the pool moment, that beginning, but it is out of, I think, it is to a certain extent not only out of a respect for your audience, saying I believe you will be with me, but it's also a demand. It's saying you need to step up. This is going to be something special, and it's going to be unique, and it's going to be a little bit challenging.
This is not going to just be presented to you on
That's
live.
right. That's right. And guess what? Here we go. And I love that. I love that about it. I'm a big fan of theater that makes people feel smart. And Hamilton certainly does that.
So, just one more question about Hamilton. So, you guys are obviously, phenomenally successful Broadway run. I'm sure the show is going to play for 10 years on Broadway. Cross fingers. But you're about to start the process of the touring productions. Yeah. Which means that maybe some of us will finally actually get a chance to see the show live. Yeah. So, what are the I'm sure we could talk for an hour just about the challenges that you're facing on trying to figure out how to, take this custom built very complicated sound system that you built for the Richard Rodgers and figure out how to take that on the road, and not only, build a system that can be torn apart and put together repeatedly as the show moves around. So can you just talk about that for a moment and sort of what your approach is?
Yeah. I mean, right now we're actually in the shop with the Chicago company. I was just before you and I went on the air here, I was corresponding with my associate sound designer, Jason Crystal, about the build that's happening in New Jersey right now at PRG Audio for the Chicago company, which is our first company after Broadway. Now, that one's unique because it's actually a replica. It's an install. So it's just, we're not touring that one. We're going into Chicago, and fingers crossed it'll run for a good long time.
So that's going to be a sit down production.
That's a sit down, yeah. So basically, we went to Chicago and I designed a sound system for that theater that is of similar quality and requirements as the New York show, but it's actually a much bigger theater. It's a 1,900 seat theater, which is a third again as big as New York. So from what I like to call, I divide these things into front end and back end. I don't know if you guys use that term. I imagine you don't in film and TV, but basically a front end system is your console and your wireless and all your input side, right? Your microphone systems, your band input systems, your cast input systems, and then the back end, which is your monitoring systems and your loudspeaker systems for the venue. So Hamilton will stay fairly intact on the front end. We feel pretty confident about how we dialed in the wireless systems. I mean, they'll change a little bit because of
so everything coming into the console.
Yeah, that's right. The input side, basically. Yeah. So all of that front end stuff, including the console, will remain pretty much intact. We've changed a few things because of changing technology in the wireless end with the bandwidth issues that the FCC has gifted us. But primarily, and some refined ideas about ways we could improve it, but we haven't really, that's not a wholesale overhaul of what we did on the front side of the system. It's a basic approach has remained the same. The back end is completely different. It's a virtually redo from the back end for the loudspeaker system in the house, and even the monitoring system, even though the locations are pretty much the same, all of that technology is newer and has changed, and we've upgraded. The touring system is a very good question, and that's actually one we've just started talking about because our first tour is going out in March of next year. And, we're just starting to see set drawings for what that piece of scenery, that scenic design is going to look like, how quickly it has to move, which is actually the big, there's the truck space, how many trucks it has to fit in, and how fast you have to turn over between cities. Those are the issues that determine what kind of sound system you can troupe, essentially.
Sure.
So those decisions are being made now, and you're right. It's a huge challenge, and it's agonizing because you can't get it all right. You can't be right all the time. You're trying to provide your road engineers with the best possible tools to make good decisions on the road. But yeah, you're going to definitely, I always say that doing Broadway it's kind of the art of being specific, right? Like generic is the enemy on Broadway in all ways, both from the content point of view, just like we were talking about gunshots even, if you're doing something generic, you haven't really thought it through. That's the enemy. Well, on the road, unfortunately, generic, is part of the game. You have to be a little bit generic, and that can be heartbreaking, because you don't want it to be, but sadly, you don't really have a choice. So
sure. So, I was kidding around about it before, but I have to ask just because I'm such a huge fan. What was it like? What was your experience working with Mike Nichols on Spamalot?
Oh, Mike. I first got to work with Mike on the Seagull, actually, in Central Park. That's where I and my business partners met him. Yeah, we did. We had we did the Shakespeare in the Park at the Delacorte for many years, and actually, Mike was our first client there, basically, when I was with Acme. And the Seagull was a star-studded project, and we went to Mike's house to talk to him about it, and it was just overwhelming because it's Mike Nichols, and yet as smart and clever and elevated and kind of wicked as he was, he could also be incredibly warm, and I miss him. Just before and Hamilton and working with him on Spamalot was just a joy. I mean, I think he made something. Spamalot was a hilarious process and a hilarious show, but I don't think it could have been what it was without Mike. I think he found every opportunity for humor and heart in that show that he could have. And I think that's what the audience responded to. Plus there's that cast that he assembled, which,
Sure.
I don't know if you've heard that joke about, I hope I tell the story right, that Mike Nichols, the Mike Nichols story, which is an actor's agent called him and said, hey, Mike Nichols wants you to be in his new play. He called and you got the part. And so that's the good news. And the actor said, what's the bad news? And the bad news says, well, it's only $2,000 a week. And the actor said, well, I don't know if I can get that much together right now, but I'll try, because everybody wants to work for Mike Nichols,
sure.
And the cast he got for that company. I mean, not only getting to be in the room with Mike and to listen to him work with actors and to work with the designers and the team, but to be in the room with David Hyde Pierce and Hank Azaria. I mean, it was crazy. It was crazy. These guys that were just so talented and so funny and so generous. And Tim Curry, who, would sing up on stage, and I would just cry because it was, it was Tim Curry. It was the guy, it was Frankenfurter. It was like nothing you've ever seen and nothing we'll ever see again. And so working with Mike was like that. It was like the opportunity to be with a legend. I have some great photographs because when we were workshopping Hamilton, and this was not long before he died, he came to see the workshop. He was invited, and he and Tommy spoke for a long time afterwards, and I got to see him as well and have a quick chat with him. And he was over the moon. He thought that something, for Mike to say that something groundbreaking and extraordinary had happened, that it was genius, was, to hear Mike Nichols say that, was pretty incredible, and it was a great moment. I was so pleased he got to see it, and so pleased to get to see him, and it was a great loss. He's a great loss. Those were memorable days, and I think always will be career highlights too. Yeah,
I'm sure. Yeah, sometimes you just have to pinch yourself and say, "Am I really in this room? Is this really happening around?"
Yeah, I do it a lot. I just worked on a great show called Bright Star. Had a similar experience with Steve Martin and Edie Brickell, and the same kind of thing where you're working alongside and with these geniuses and these lovely people who are all out to just make something good. And, that's the kind of thing where I count myself very lucky to be working on shows like that. And I continue to have a great career of working on great projects with great people.
Yeah. So just shifting gears for a little bit, I'm curious for you to talk just very briefly about, so musicals to one side, when you're doing, a straight play like a Bengal Tiger at the Baghdad Zoo, or, because I'll say it again because I love saying it, motherfucker with the hat,
right?
Or Venus in Fur.
Yeah.
What's the role of the sound designer in a show like that?
Those tend to be, I often describe, again, being somewhat reductive, I often describe doing musicals as being a reactive job, right? Where you're trying to kind of do your best at processing information for an audience and trying to react to the material in a very elevated way. And I think that plays, in this case, non-musicals, let's call them, tend to be a little more proactive because they require a little more attention to content than do musicals. So your conversations in plays like Terrence McNally's Mother and Sons and Venus and Fur, those tend to get a little deeper with the director and the playwright about what kind of atmosphere you're trying to create using sound or music, either pre-recorded or original. And, and then often there are naturalistic requirements. I mean, the plot just requires sound, door knocks, cell phone rings, things like that, thunderclaps, which like Venus and Fur was a symphony of thunderclaps and cell phone rings, among other things. But so it's again, but generic is the enemy. It's the same conversation. You're trying to get to first you deal with like, what are the essence of the required elements of what you're trying to create? And then what's the best version of the audio landscape, of the soundscape for this play? How do you create an environment in which this story can be told in the best possible way? And how can you support the story? I mean, one of my favorite examples of this is actually in Venus and Fur, which, has a lot of, like I said, it's a symphony of thunderclaps, and each one had to be placed, and each one had its own character, and how we were going to, how they were going to interact with the lighting, and there was all of that. But then, there's a moment in this, it's a rehearsal room. For those of you who don't know the play, that it's a director basically running a very odd audition for a woman who's really going to turn on him.
This is this to me is a really interesting example to talk about, because this is literally two people talking in a room.
Yes.
For the entirety of the play.
Yes.
So what was your approach into that?
Well, one, you obviously, talking with the playwright and the director about the rhythm of what they're trying to achieve. And again, there's some of these things that, there's a storm, and there's going to be thunderclaps that are going to interrupt the action. And then there are cell phone rings because they need to have conversations with each other and with their spouses or their partners. And there's that. But the conversations we even, got to where there's a moment where Wanda turns out the lights in the rehearsal room that they're in, these overhead fluorescent lights. And she goes to a breaker panel upstage that was installed on the set to do it. And of course the breakers are dummies, but we auditioned breaker panels to make sure that those sounds that they were making were correct, because it wasn't enough that she went and turned the lights off and there was a little click. We wanted there to have some visceral reactions. We were auditioning circuit breakers at one point.
You need to have the right ka-thunk.
That's right. I mean, and you know all about this, right? And then my favorite moment, which I can't imagine anyone else actually noticed. There was a coffee pot on stage, typical like rehearsal room coffee pot with a clear glass beaker and a hot plate, drip coffee. And at one point, the director goes over and pours himself a cup of coffee and puts the coffee pot back on the hot plate. And I actually had hidden a speaker in a garbage can right near that coffee pot, so that when he set the coffee pot down, it actually spattered. It made a spatter sound, a little sizzle. And when I first played that in rehearsal, the actor jumped. He wasn't expecting it, but he ended up loving it. It was like a little touch of reality, and to make that room feel that much more real and that much more alive, right? That you're trying to reinforce the idea, and sometimes you're reinforcing the reality and the naturalism of a moment. And sometimes you're trying to reinforce the supernaturalism of a moment, right? The unreality of a moment. So those thunders would grow and those thunders would be exaggerated. You'd never hear thunder like that actually inside that room. You're in the interior of a building, but that didn't matter. What we were trying to do was achieve an effect and disturb the audience in a certain way. So those kinds of conversations, that's the approach, is what, again, you're always going backwards. I think you're always trying to find out what's the goal? How are you trying to how is the audience supposed to feel? Right. And then and only then are you actually asking, and what are the tools I have to make them feel this way, right?
I'm kind of curious to see if you had the same sort of phenomenon in the theater. Walter Murch, the famous, cinema sound designer and editor, talks about, I'm going to butcher this, but he talks about image as the front door that information comes to the audience.
Yes.
And sound is the back door. And because it's working on a more subliminal level that you're not necessarily consciously thinking of, you have great dramatic license to be much more abstract with the sound than the literal images necessarily would imply that you could. And you could take the audience on a much, you can do a lot to them with the sound that you wouldn't normally think that you could. So I'm wondering, does that phenomenon exist in the theater as well? Because obviously that that's the image is much more literal even in the cinema, because you're in the space with the actors, you're looking right at them.
Yeah.
And you can never escape the fact that you're all in the same space together.
Yeah.
But so with something like Venus and Fur, do you use ambiances and tones and sound effects in a way to manipulate the emotions of the audience?
Yeah. I mean, Venus and Fur, as I said, I mean, you can certainly, even just in where the sound is coming from, those ambient sounds and room tones and things like that. Sure, electrical hums, things like the coffee, like very specific spot effects. One of the interesting, I mean, and Murch was absolutely right. I believe that. And subscribe to it. The one thing that's tricky about theater, as you say, is that, you can't escape that moment where the actor's in front of you and the band is there. And so you have kind of both jobs, right? Like the tricky bit is, and I think this is true in film probably too, where you have to continually draw a direct line between what's happening in front of you and the audience, right? You don't want to disturb that in any way, because that's your bread and butter. But there's this whole other thing that happens around them, and marrying the two can be very tricky. I would say that Bright Star actually is a good example of this. I mean, and it might appeal to some of your listeners to know that Bright Star is a bluegrass musical. Steve and Edie wrote this beautiful score of bluegrass music, and the play takes place in some North Carolina towns, some of which exist and some of which were fictional. And I actually, in preparation for that, I had been to North Carolina a few times, but I just didn't know what it sounded like. And I knew we had a lot of exterior moments in the play where we were going to be in environments where I thought, wouldn't it be nice if, against this very neutral backdrop, but we knew we were outside, that it was kind of an abstract set, that I could help reinforce the sense of place. And again, generic is the enemy. So I actually went to North Carolina for 3 days and brought my location recorder and went out into the woods and out into the swamps and just even if for my now some of that material made it into Bright Star. It was in the theater. We heard those recordings, but some of it was also just a model for me to know what these places sounded like, so that I could develop very sort of abstract or heightened versions of them. And I'll give you a good example of the climactic moment in Bright Star was outside on a front porch, an early evening, and there were birds, evening birds, North Carolina birds chirping, and some insects buzzing, and a prop, I don't want to ruin the story, but a prop is presented that clearly upsets one of our main characters. And at that moment that the prop arrives on stage, the bird stops singing. Right. And this is incredibly subtle. I can't imagine it registered consciously for any member of the audience. But as a designer, the idea to be able to manipulate sound, of course the birds wouldn't stop singing, right? The birds would sing and the insects would keep going. But to remove one element at that moment that I had established early in this very cheerful scene, which suddenly became very solemn, and to be able to basically flip the switch and change the atmosphere for that moment. The audience was already experienced. They identified this object, and they already knew that there was the drama was contained in the object and the presentation of this object. But to be able to reinforce it, right, and by simply changing the atmosphere in an abstract, completely non-realistic way, that's I think a little bit about what Murch is talking about. It's the side door. It's saying I'm, and it's also insisting on trying to participate in the event, right? It's saying, I'm responsible for part of this, and I'm going to try and help. And, sometimes that's successful and sometimes it's not. And often those ideas don't work, and they get, that you try them for a couple of previews and the next night they're not in and they go away, and never to be heard from again. Sure. But occasionally you get one and you sort of delight in it because you've done your part, right? You've done your part. Yeah.
So I just have one last question for you. I'm curious about what are the changes that you've seen in your work over the course of your career, and just one thing specifically I was thinking about is, the issue of miking actors and amplification in the theater. How has that changed over the course of even the time that you've been doing this in the business?
I think there's been an interesting through line that's a lot of it hasn't changed that much. The technology's gotten different. Some of it's gotten better. And of course, now the pressure's on to make it even better because of spectrum issues in terms of miking actors. The thing that's fascinating me right now is people on Broadway are experimenting. And this is actually interesting because of Atmos, might tie into this. There's a lot of experimentation going on right now active experimentation and success. Some of it is successful going on with localization of amplification sources. So what typically on Broadway, once you've kind of delivering an actor's amplification path, it stays pretty static. Through the years, there have been people moving the delay essentially on that microphone input to match the acoustic delay as somebody moves upstage and downstage. And sometimes there's some light panning left to right through a sound system, but it's hard because these systems are very complicated and every seat is getting, multiple speaker systems. But what's happening now is a kind of devotion to trying to kind of a renewed effort to actually have the amplified sound follow the actor much more closely. And people,
are you talking about the experience? I'm just trying to understand.
Yep.
So you're talking about an actor walks stage left to stage right, or maybe front of stage to the back of stage. You're talking about treating their vocals so that they seem to be moving through the space.
That's correct.
As opposed to the amplified voice still coming from the same exact spot.
That's right.
No matter where the actor is moving or standing.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And so, this isn't a new idea. I mean, this has been around, I think, since the 80s that people have been trying to do this. And there have been many attempts at it. And it's just kind of come back around again. And the technology has gotten very sophisticated by which you can do this kind of matrixing. It's a very complicated matrix, obviously. And there are companies now developing interaction software with RFID tags and telemetry, essentially. So you can actually tag an actor, and actually the software will actually track them around your mapped space, and the amplification
will adjust
in theory will adjust accordingly and follow them around. And there are people doing it to my mind with varying degrees of success, and it's exciting because it's a kind of quest, right? One of the big complaints about seeing a live Broadway show is that I didn't know who was talking, because all I heard was this amplified voice, and it was hard to identify the source. Now, I know many of us sound designers work very hard to try and avoid that phenomenon. It's a syndrome, right? And you can do a lot of things to try and connect the amplified material to the acoustic material in these relatively small rooms, but it's a tricky business. And so these software and hardware packages that are helping us do it, that map the space, and that you can sort of impose on your sound system to give it the software control of some of that is very interesting. And there are a lot of sound designers who are making good use of it. So I think that's one of the big things that's happening, like at this very moment, that's really interesting and exciting, and also not always successful, which I think is also part of what's interesting and exciting. Like I don't think it's particularly interesting when everybody went, like when it's like, hey, it works, good, on to the next thing. Like that's not necessarily the most interesting part. The most interesting part is struggling with a problem and seeing the solutions that people come up with.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, this has been a great conversation. I feel like I've learned a ton. So Nevin, I really appreciate you taking the time and talking with us today about Hamilton and about sound design for the theater. This has been another episode of the Conversations with Sound Artists podcast from the Dolby Institute and the SoundWorks collection. Nevin Steinberg, thank you again.
Thanks for having me.